Okay, Andrew, as always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. We can't see you at the moment, but that doesn't worry us too much so long as we can hear you. I think it is over to you. You're going to talk to us about social supermarkets and your experience of them and anything else you'd like to tell us, if that's all right.
Great. And I'm sorry about this. It's all in a good cause, I can assure you. I just sought refuge here in a coffee shop on the outskirts of Chelmsford in Essex, ahead of going to a mobile social supermarket later this morning. So it's very topical at least.
Yes.
But above all else, thank you as always for inviting me along to today's meeting of the Alliance. It's always a pleasure and a tutorial to learn from you around recent developments in Cornwall, how we can learn from them and how we can shape future developments in the process. It dawned on me looking ahead to this morning's meeting that it's nigh on a year since the Alliance was very kind to host Rose and me for a couple of days visits in and around Newquay and Truro. And I thought, well, it seems fitting really to have my remarks to you this morning represent something of a postcard to Cornwall on some of the work that we've been undertaking nationally in the year that's passed since that visit, and in particular on 3 or 4 areas that I recall featuring heavily in that visit. The first of them relates really to one of the overriding memories of those 2 days, which Anna was standing in the CPR food bank and hearing Joyce articulate to me what success would look like for the food bank over these next 5 to 10 years. And she looks over to the left-hand side of the hall where the food element was taking place. And she said, this will be so much quieter than it is today because hardly anyone needs to use it. And then she looks to the right-hand side of the hall. We had all the wraparound services and advice workers present. And she said that side of the hall will be a hive of activity because that's where people are going to be getting to the bottom of what's gone wrong at home, actually getting a resolution in place sooner rather than later. And I've taken that conversation with me into successive meetings with government since then on the likely shape of a 3-year funding programme that's coming into effect from next April called the Crisis and Resilience Fund. And while that fund sits under the auspices of the Department for Work and Pensions, it will involve Cornwall Council and every local authority receiving a share of funding, in part to respond swiftly to household crises, with perhaps a direct bank transfer or the direct issuing of a supermarket or fuel voucher, or the direct issuing of white goods of some kind, but then also accompanying that some investment in place-based approaches that can support resilience. And in particular, influenced by that conversation at CPR, will be things like paying for services to co-locate with one another so as to improve massively the accessibility of advice and support for people who are really struggling to make ends meet. In particular, could that advice and support be co-located with food banks and social supermarkets, those touch points, if you like, where people in dire need are reaching out for support, even if they've not previously been in touch with their local authority or advice agency. Now, it's looking likely that local authorities will receive their guidance on how best to allocate that fund within these next 2 months, ahead of them being able to spend it from next April and over the following 3 years. So something to look out for there is an opportunity to further reform the local advice landscape, perhaps alongside food banks and indeed social supermarkets. A second abiding memory of that visit a year ago was learning really for the first time in depth from Lewis and the brilliant team that work on the holiday activities and food programme in Cornwall, just how much of a success you've made of HAF as it's known in recent years, and how you think this good programme could be made into a truly great programme. The preconditions to all of that when we were together was that we needed certainty from the government that the HAF funding would roll over beyond its planned expiry date this year. So much of our work at Feeding Britain since that visit has gone into campaigning for the renewal of the HAF money. And thank goodness at the end of August, the government confirmed a renewal for the next 3 years into 2026, 27 and 28. What that's enabled us to do more recently is move the conversation with government away from the need to renew the programme and firmly onto the territory of improving the programme. And I should hope we'll be finding out again within these next couple of months what greater flexibility could be given to local authorities to enable you to tailor the HAF model to your local needs and circumstances, whether that's around the eligibility criteria or what groups of children and young people are or are not able to access HAF, whether that's greater flexibility over which times of the year can be covered with the HAF funding, whether there's an even greater push towards a tailored HAF model for 12 and 16-year-olds. They're the sorts of things that we've now been able to explore with the DfE. Now we know that that bedrock of HAF support will be in place, at the very least, through to this time in 2028. And then thirdly, as you touched upon, Anna, is the ongoing development of what could be badged social supermarkets, others might call food clubs or pantries, basically that contributory, often membership-based tier of community food provision that, on the one hand, seeks to prevent at least some people seeking help for emergency food parcels from food banks in the first place, and on the other hand, seeks to provide something of a stepping stone out of a reliance on emergency food parcels and back towards people being able to pay their own way, so to speak. And one of the main developments since Rose and I were with you a year ago has been, for the first time, Feeding Britain convening that wider group of like-minded social supermarket organisations running across the UK, just to see, firstly, if we could work together on enhancing the supply of nutritious food into this model. Secondly, there's some joint advocacy we could undertake, and things like eligibility for the Healthy Start programme, particularly for poorer working families. But then thirdly, could we start to tell a shared story and gauge our collective impact as a social supermarket food club collective on a whole range of outcomes, including but not limited to the indicators of household food insecurity. And just in the past few days, we've published our first little effort on that score. And I'll try not to bore you to tears with numbers and statistics, but if you'll indulge me for a moment, what we've found collectively by surveying thousands of social supermarket members is that roughly half of those members have never used a food bank before, suggesting that we may be succeeding in part in preventing that initial need for an emergency food parcel. And of those half of so members who had previously accessed a food bank, a clear majority have now either ceased entirely using a food bank or at the very least have reduced significantly their use of a food bank. So some positive indicators on that front. Sticking with food insecurity, 2/3 of social supermarket members are now skipping meals much less often than they used to, if at all. 78% of people are now eating more fruit and vegetables as a result of accessing them through this social supermarket or food club model. Around 80% of people are feeling less stressed or worried or anxious about being able to access or afford food. Then moving beyond those sort of food insecurity based indicators, 2/3 of people say that the social supermarket food club has acted as a gateway into that wider support network to deal with issues like, say, debt, housing, council tax, even health and social security benefits. Those limits that poverty had placed on their lives are now being busted by accessing that wider support through the social markets. And we have around 80% of people saying that they now feel more connected to their local community and less cut off or isolated than they used to in trying to navigate life's many complexities. That, of course, will be linked to that previous indicator around easier access to support services, but it is actually linked also to the availability of social and fun activities that often take place in or alongside the social supermarket or the food club. This is actually somewhere they can come for a nice communal meal, the odd day trip out with their fellow members. It's where they come to catch up on the local gossip with their fellow members and volunteers. It's a place that they genuinely look forward to spending some of their week. And what's interesting now is that when we look at beyond the impacts and outcomes associated with this model, is the actual trends in supply and demand. So since we were last together a year ago, the Food Standards Agency have published 2 surveys looking at trends in usage of food banks across the country alongside trends in access to this social supermarket food club model. And in both of those surveys, they've found that a high proportion of people are now able to access the latter model than have to use the former. And in actual fact, across those two surveys, the gap has begun widening because consistent data coming from the likes of Trussell and elsewhere, we are over these past 18 months seeing a welcome reduction, and in some parts of the UK, a significant reduction in demand for emergency food parcels from food banks, while we also see this continued embrace of the social supermarket food club model. So there are, of course, challenges because while there remain gaps in that model, and today in Feeding Gloucestershire, for example, not dissimilar conversations are taking place around gaps in access to affordable, nutritious food in the county, and how, if at all, this model could be tailored to meet those gaps in a way that goes with the grain of local circumstances. We're then looking also at, okay, if there's an existing model in place, let's not make do with any old model where there's, perhaps some random odds and sods on the shelves. How can we realise the full potential of this model, rather like with HAF that I was describing a moment ago? And since, again, Rose and I were with you a year ago, we've begun to see some great practice emerging from clusters of social supermarkets and food clubs coming together almost as a bit of a cooperative to buy in bulk their good quality fruit and veg, their good quality dairy produce, their bakery, their meat, as well as long life and those sort of stock up essentials, so that you can underpin a good minimum offer for social supermarket food club members. And then, of course, add to that with whatever we can get our hands on from donated or surplus produce. That's the way things are heading at the moment. What's been rather interesting is to observe and, for full transparency, encourage the linkages with food banks and social supermarkets or food clubs. And that's really taken three forms. Perhaps this could be also of relevance to that crisis and resilience fund I mentioned a moment ago, because the DWP's overriding objective for this fund is to achieve further and sustained reductions in reliance on emergency food parcels from food banks. There are some food banks that have decided to convert entirely from their emergency food parcel model into something of a social supermarket or food club. There are others who have said, well, while we don't feel ready to embrace that whole shift, what we will do is perhaps add on a social supermarket or food club to our existing emergency service in the hope that we can build up the numbers of people accessing the affordable model and thereby minimise the use of our emergency service. There's been a third group of food banks that say that while they don't perhaps have the capacity or the resource to run or offer a social supermarket themselves, what they would wish to do is perhaps issue vouchers to people who have had an initial food parcel from themselves that they can then take to their nearest food club that's subsidised with a first few number of shops there or a first initial period of membership while they get more money in their pocket so they can then become paying members. And there have been some big Trussell food banks offering that service in recent months, saying that as a result of doing so, they've had their quietest year in 7, 8 or 8 years or even more than that. So that's been the broad reflection, if you like, on the past year across the wider Feeding Britain network. But I shall never be foolish enough to pretend that these place-based developments alone could guarantee everyone's access to affordable, nutritious food in Cornwall, let alone other parts of the country. Hence our ongoing advocacy to actually get more money in people's pockets in the first place. And a lot of our effort over this past year has gone into trying to persuade the government to lift the 2-child limit that exists within the benefit system. All of our data show that, shockingly, but not surprisingly, the moment a family increases to 2 children or fewer to 3 children or more, their risk of hunger and the need for an emergency food parcel goes through the roof. It more than trebles. So I'm daring to hope we may see some action on that in either next week's budget or the forthcoming child poverty strategy. In a not dissimilar vein, we are encouraging the government to modernise the way it upgrades social security benefits each year as a bare minimum to ensure that poorer people don't suffer real terms cuts in their income. It is a risk with the current rather outdated annual uprating process. I think we'll have a moment of truth in the child poverty strategy on the government stance towards auto enrolment for both free school meals and Healthy Start across the country. Ditto on whether the eligibility criteria for Healthy Start will be expanded in a welcome way that's been achieved with free school meals from this forthcoming September. And also looking at the pressures on household budgets. Another clear message I took away from Newquay was the unenviable choice that people face between paying for their heating oil, or in other areas, their gas and electricity, or actually being able to buy the food they need. And we've been doing a lot of work with Ofgem and central government itself, looking at how we could ease pressure on people's fuel bills. And again, the briefings from government suggest we're going to see some action there. So that's my rather long-winded postcard back to you in Cornwall on this past year's activity. But Anna and colleagues, I'd love to take any questions you have or any challenges or thoughts you have on where we could go next together.
Andrew, thank you so much. You are always an absolute pleasure to listen to. And I don't know about anybody else, but my notes are very detailed always from what you've got to say. I do have a couple of questions, if I may, and then I'll open it up to others. Just in terms of the social supermarkets, I mean, the word supermarket itself has connotations. How do you feel? And I know you're talking about membership clubs, really, but do you get any sort of sense that supermarkets, as the rest of the population knows them, have any views on social supermarkets? How do they react when they hear the word social supermarket, or they know that something like this is being opened up in their area?
It's always been in my mind, Anna, when new social supermarkets or food clubs open up, what will be the reception from either the bigger retailers in their community, or perhaps those smaller convenience stores that often exist, and particularly, let's face it, in food deserts, where people have limited access to affordable, nutritious food. My genuine overriding experience has been a positive one. And actually, I'm over the road from a big Sainsbury's right now. They have directly resourced a lot of this work because they're interested in preventative models when it comes to reducing the use of food banks and reducing the likelihood of families suffering in silence at home. We often see at an individual store level, either the manager or the community champion asking their staff to volunteer for more social supermarkets, or to donate certain quantities of stock, or perhaps to even donate certain community grants. With the convenience stores, I think because social supermarkets, in a tiny handful of cases, open 5 or 6 days a week, and for a majority of the day, overwhelmingly tend to open perhaps for 2 days a week, a morning and an evening, to help people in work. And I think that the off-licenses and convenience stores have realised, well, operating along those lines, they ain't going to lose a lot of custom to the social supermarket. And the chances are that by freeing up some household income, by saving money on their healthier goods in the social supermarket, it means they've got a little bit more money to buy their newspaper and 1 or 2 treats for the convenience store. So it's been an overwhelmingly positive experience from my perspective.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic to hear, because that's certainly something that I know worries some people. You're exactly as you're saying, how other retailers are going to react. And I'm really interested to hear that they don't see them as a threat. That's really encouraging. And then my other question is also around, obviously this is in effect a retail model. How do the ones that are currently running them, how do they balance the commercial aspect that requires staff, cash handling, that sort of thing, alongside the use of volunteers in what is, to a certain extent, a commercial environment? It's not the same as a fully retail outlet, but nonetheless, there is a retail element. Again, have you any thoughts, guidance, insight on that aspect?
Yes, one thought I have, and again, it's always in my mind in these conversations, is that over these past 3, 4, 5 years, where we've seen the genuine growth and embrace of this model, is you've had a small army of people across the country who are big-hearted, community-minded folk that have become a sort of professional retail experts and bargain hunters. It's quite remarkable. But what they're saying is they don't feel this has been forced upon them in any way. It is their way of responding to a most pressing and urgent need in the communities that they seek to serve and about which they care so much. And so while there's a broad spectrum of social supermarket and food club models, where perhaps at one end you've got a wholly volunteer-run food club that sources all the food it needs from surplus and donated goods, where they're fortunate that that guarantees them a pipeline of good quality and in high quantities fruit and veg, poultry, dairy, you name it. And basically the revenue generated from membership fees covers the cost of acquiring that surplus. They don't have any obligations like rent or utilities. Great. The median food club will perhaps operate with pounds and pence, in other words, individual pricing like a normal shop. Yes, there will be that merry band of volunteers, but more often than not at least one paid member of staff to run the show. And then maybe they contribute a little bit of rent towards the hall or the space they use. For that median food club, and then those at the other end of the spectrum, with a big pay staff, a big cafe on site, burgeoning membership and so on, we do offer at Feeding Britain template policies on things like cash handling, lone worker policies, all the necessary training requirements with environmental health and so on. Because you're right, Anna, it is wholly different in many cases from what these big-hearted community folk have been used to running.
Yeah. Yeah, and that contextualized nature can be quite a challenge, can't it, if you're moving from one type of organisation to another. Andrew, thank you. That's brilliant. Can I just open this up? Anybody else got any questions at this point? Matt, I'm sorry to spring this on you, but I just wonder whether you might have some thoughts from the council's perspective on this and your experience. And Matthew, I think you might want to come in, but Matthew, do you want to go first because you're about to leave? Sorry, Matt, having asked you. Matthew, did you want to come in?
That's very kind. Thank you, Anna. And Andrew, great to hear the update. And I love the way you framed it as a postcard from Chelmsford. Thank you. I haven't been to your website recently, so I'm sorry, but I'm looking forward. I know you didn't want to hit us with loads of slides or data, but I am really interested to know to hear about the scale of the movement and the work you've been doing to convene this network of thousands of members around the country. I'm really interested in catching up on that. Is there any material that we can read as well or look at about the state of the movement as it stands? And I'm particularly interested in its supply dynamics. So if I understand the success of the model in its social solidarity terms, but in terms of the nature of its input, it's a bit like the work that Anna did with Transformation CPR on sourcing at value, at quality, at sustainability. They're quite hard things to triangulate, and just interested to understand a bit more about that. Thank you.
Excellent, Matthew. I mean, one bit of homework I'll take away with me is to share with Ben and Anna and Gemma for wider circulation a full copy of that briefing that contains those data and other observations on the wider development of social supermarkets and food clubs. I'm conscious, Anna, I have another outstanding piece of homework around energy costs for both households and suppliers. So I shall add that to my list. And Matthew, it's really quite powerful to reflect on time since you and I began getting to know one another around 4 years ago, wasn't it? When, let's face it, all of us in the meeting today, and presumably all of our friends and relatives, were all too painfully familiar with food banks and the widespread nature of food banks and the kind of necessity of food banks in helping people stave off hunger. And yet at that time, relatively few of us, let alone our friends and relatives, would have heard of this social supermarket or food club model. And I just think it's therefore doubly striking that in those successive official government surveys, we see more people now accessing that latter model than using food banks. That's quite a powerful, fundamental shift that's taken place. And I think what helps to explain it in part is that, yes, there are people who had sadly needed to rely quite heavily on food banks, have now instead been able to move into social supermarket or food club membership. But actually, I've observed, and particularly here in Essex, in some of the models, there's actually a wider group of what you might call working class households, particularly pensioners and those in part-time work, who might not have felt able in some ways to access a food bank before, but actually feel quite able, if not happy, to make use of a social supermarket or food club. So we're really starting to bind together the interests, I hope, of the very poorest people and that sort of broader working class group of people in this food club social supermarket model, which, again, at the risk of going on, I do apologise, does have sufficient flexibility, I find, in responding to those cases where people don't have two halfpennies to rub together and couldn't afford to make a contribution. It could either be the fact they've built up a pay it forward or reserve or solidarity fund to look after those crisis situations, or we're finding that housing associations or local authorities are themselves perhaps making funded referrals to look after those crisis situations, because they're determined that tenants and residents shouldn't lose out on that freedom of choice, that dignity of feeling like you're making a purchase, even if you're in utter crisis. So there's been some rather lovely, unexpected consequences emerging alongside this model.
Thanks, Andrew. Matthew, hopefully that answers your question. And yes, lovely to see you. Mary Rose, I think you've joined us, so thank you very much. Sorry, Matt, I don't like to put people on the spot, but I'm always really keen that we do hear the council's perspective, and you are our man at the council. So don't feel obliged, but if there's anything you wanted to add to that, we'd all be really pleased to hear it.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And yeah, Andrew's right that yeah, it's been a long process, which has been a really exciting one, and also I think that time spent with the food banks, certainly opens your eyes to the potential that there sits within the community. I could talk for hours about this because we've been working on it together through the CFA for so long, and also through the Sustainable Food Cornwall and other groups around that approach. And I think Andrew summarised it really well. There is an approach to this. We can't end food banks overnight. I'm really proud of the work that fellow colleagues in Cornwall Council have done around the Household Support Fund that we set up a while ago. Its development through that, which is always from the very first outset, has been about maximising income and making sure that support's there. So it really starts at that place, and then the evolution of the food banks work that our colleagues in Healthy Cornwall are doing, where we're supporting Citizens Advice to go into, and Andrew summarised that how that's worked at CPR Food Bank really well. I think we're looking to further develop that work. I know that Ben sent an email out a little while ago about the skills boot camps that are being worked, partly through the Get Britain working strategy, but also through our local working strategies around employment and the economy and employment strategy that we've got, so that we're supporting people to get back to work as well, where we know they may have been out of the workplace for long-term health conditions, but actually there's the two sides of supporting people develop skills, but we're also working really hard to support employers to help people with long-term conditions stay in the workplace or come back into the workplace as well. So we're really looking at that full holistic support. The development of the Household Support Fund into the Crisis Fund that will be coming soon will be led by the same team. They'll be working hard on supporting families and the vulnerable groups. Hopefully everyone saw the news that Cornwall has supported the auto-enrolment of free school meals now, and so we'll be moving to that by September. So all of those changes are really, really strong action, but I think as well, we've worked hard to make sure that groups like the CFA can stay in touch with those decisions. We do a lot through Transformation Cornwall and others around the Household Support Fund, the maximising income and the routes to preventing the need for food banks. So all of that, I feel, is come together really well under a lot of different agendas now. And I think, the next development around social supermarkets, again, is a really exciting opportunity. And I know there's definitely a willingness to support that through the local authority.
Yeah. Brilliant, Matt. That is so fantastic to hear. And I do think this social supermarket movement is something that CFA is going to need to pick up and kind of get people together to see how we can explore this further, because I'm sure the potential for it across Cornwall is just going to be huge. And it would be, I think, as Andrew has highlighted, working together on this as a county could bring so many benefits rather than just everybody doing their own kind of thing. So, Matt, thank you very much for that. Unless anybody's got anything else they wanted from Andrew, I don't see any hands coming up or anybody unmuting. Andrew, as always, thank you so much for joining us. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us. We know how busy you are. And please just keep doing everything you're doing. You have our absolute support. And if there's ever anything you need from us in order to support you in your work, please do let us know, because we will always do our best to do that. But thank you very much. And I think you're probably going to disappear now, but have a lovely day, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.